Okay, thanks, Mihal. Interpretable clustering is an area in which there's been some pretty dramatic progress in the last 3 or 4 years. And what I wanted to do is just talk about some of this work. Okay, so I'll start with a quick overview. So in interpretable ML, it seems like much of the focus is on classification, and that's very important. But unsupervised learning is also an area that is really ripe for work in interpretability. Basically, methods like clustering, topic modeling are used to make sense of some very large and complex data sets. They're widely used, they're very effective, and the utility of these methods would be greatly increased if the models they produced were actually interpretable or understandable. Okay. So, um, so I'll talk specifically about clustering, and a natural starting point is k-means, since that's probably the most popular clustering method by far. Okay, so in the k-means clustering problem, the starting point, you have a data set of endpoints. So let's call them x1 through xn, and these are just some vectors, say in d-dimensional space. And then you have a target number of clusters that we'll call k. And the goal in k-means is to output centers for these clusters. So we'll be calling them mu1 through mu k, just vectors in RD. And each of the data points will be associated with its closest center. That's how the clusters are defined. And the goal is to find centers that minimize this cost function. So this cost is the sum over all data points of the distance from that data point to the nearest center squared. So squared Euclidean distance. Okay, so it's the k-means cost function. And this is NP hard, like almost every optimization problem in unsupervised learning. But there are plenty of algorithms that are reasonable, practical, widely used. For example, Lloyd's k-means heuristic, which is often just called the k-means algorithm, or k-means plus plus, or a whole bunch of constant factor approximation algorithms. So it's an NP-hard problem for which basically there are plenty of reasonable solution strategies. Oh, so by the way, I should say that if you have any questions, feel free to chime in. You could either type them into chat or you can just speak them out. Either one is fine. Okay. So that's k-means. And just pictorially, for example, the data points could look like these black points. Okay, so we have these data points. We ask for a certain number of clusters, in this case, 6. And then the centers are these red points here. So these would be the mu1, mu2, mu3, etc. And then each cluster is just the region of space that's closer to that center than to any other. And so the clusters are Voronoi cells. In particular, they're convex regions and pretty arbitrary looking convex regions. Okay, so that's what k-means does. And the question is this something that's understandable? Now, in this picture, the clusters are certainly very understandable, but that's because it's in 2 dimensions. And in 2 dimensions, everything's understandable. What happens in the more common setting when the data is much higher dimensional, when there might be hundreds or thousands of features? So, problem number one is that the centers themselves are not actual data points. They're just points in space. And so just looking at the center, it might be hard to ascribe any meaning or significance to it. It's basically the mean of a whole bunch of data points. Okay. So that's easy to get around. What we could do is we could just restrict the centers to be data points. So we're just going to force the centers to be data points. Okay, so then the centers themselves will make sense. But now the next problem is that the clusters are defined using L2 distance with respect to these centers. And that's something that's hard to fathom when there are a ton of features. Which are the features that really matter? Where is the greatest variability in distances? How are the different features scaled, et cetera, et cetera? Okay. So one possible way around that is to say that, well, what we'll do is that instead of specifying the cluster with centers, what we can do is to just give a few random exemplars from each cluster, just to give an overall idea of the scope of the cluster. Okay, and that, we look at a few examples and then we get an intuitive sense of what the cluster is. The problem is that this is highly inaccurate. And just looking at a few exemplars, you ascribe some pattern to it. It might not be the correct pattern. Okay. And so what would be ideal is something that's understandable but is accurate, that really precisely captures the clustering. So such a model was proposed in this paper from ICML 2020. So Nave Frost, Michal Moshkevitz, and Cyrus Rashtian. I was also an author on this paper, but the work was done by these other people. And so I'll be talking about this paper and a lot of follow-on papers, more as sort of an interested bystander than an active participant. Okay. Um, so here's the model that these people introduced. That's really very nice. Okay. So we have this data set of endpoints. Um, And now we run our favorite k-means clustering algorithm, whether it's Lloyd's or k-means plus plus, and we get back a bunch of reference centers. Okay, we get back a bunch of centers, mu1 through mu k, and it produces some clustering. Okay, and as usual with k-means, these clusters are these fairly arbitrary convex shapes. Okay, in 2D, it's understandable. In higher dimension, very hard to understand. The goal now is to approximate these to approximate these K clusters using a decision tree. And here is an example. Okay, so here the very first split of the tree is this split over here, which splits off cluster number 2. Okay, so we have cluster number 2 on the right. The next split is this one, which separates clusters 0 and 3 from cluster 1 and 4, and so on. And in this case, you can see that actually um, the the desired clustering, the k-means clustering, is very well approximated by this tree. And the end product is a tree with k leaves that's that corresponds to a decision tree, okay, which is something that is one of the most understandable models that we have. Okay, a decision tree with single feature splits that's relatively small, that's relatively shallow, pretty understandable model. So this is what we want to do. We want to produce a clustering that looks like this. Okay, and the question is, how do we do this? Okay, what is the algorithm that takes us from the k-means clustering to this nice decision tree? How do we get the decision tree? And second, how much do we lose in the process? How well can we approximate the k-means clustering? Okay, how much do we pay by moving from arbitrary convex clusters to these nice axis-aligned hyperrectangles, to this much more constrained structure? Okay, so these are the two kind of basic underlying questions over here. So in order to formalize this, okay, let's just introduce some notation. Okay, so we have our data set X, and here again is the k-means cost function. Okay, so the cost associated with a bunch of centers is the sum over all data points of the distance from the point to its closest center squared. Okay. But now, what we're actually going to be outputting is a tree. And this is a tree with k leaves, one per cluster. And so we have a cluster associated with each leaf. And now the cost is the sum over each of those leaves of the data points in the leaf, um, their total distance to the center of that cluster, which is the best choice is the mean of that leaf. Okay. And the question we're going to ask is that in moving from here to here, how much do we lose? How much greater is this cost, the cost of this greatly constrained clustering, um, versus the cost of the general k-means clustering. What is the price that we pay for interpretability? Okay, so that's question number one. And then the other question is, uh, what are the algorithms that actually produce these trees? Now, we can also ask this question for the related k-medians cost function. And this is a cost function that's not used that much in practice, but is very popular in theoretical computer science. So it's exactly the same cost function, but you replace squared Euclidean distance with L1 distance. That's the only change you make. And it's called k-medians because, well, in this case, if you have a cluster, the best place to put the center of the cluster is the mean. Whereas if you're using L1 distance and you have a cluster, the best place to put the center of the cluster is the median, the coordinate-wise median. Okay, so this thing is called k-medians. So we can ask all these same questions for k-medians, and in fact, the analysis is often a bit cleaner in this case. Okay. So this is some of the work that's been done recently. After the initial paper that I mentioned, there's been a whole slew of results, and really very significant progress has been made on this problem. Okay, it's really been great, the kind of algorithms and analysis that have come out of this. And what I'll be doing is to basically give an overview of this work. Okay, so before getting into details, just, let me just give a quick summary. What has come out of this line of work? Okay, there's all these papers. What's the bottom line over here? So first of all, we have a really nice model of interpretable clustering. Very simple clusters. Nice small decision tree. Then there's this question of the price of interpretability. How much do we lose by having such restricted clusters? And it turns out that actually we don't lose that much, okay? And the factors are now very well understood. So in the case of k-medians, the initial paper showed that we lose at most a factor of k, and that a factor of log k is inevitable. But since then, it's been improved to basically a tight bound of log k. The price of interpretability for k-medians is log k, okay? And meanwhile, for k-means, the initial paper showed k squared and a lower bound of log k, and this has now been improved to basically about a factor of k, okay? And in fact, there's a way to get this down to log k, which I'll talk about at the end. Okay. So this is the price of interpretability, and these factors, initially might look quite large, log k. But what we'll also see is that experimentally, often they're much smaller. In fact, often they're very, very close to one, like 1.1, or something like that. Okay, so we'll look at some experiments later. So that's the next thing that's come out of this literature, an understanding of the price of interpretability. The third thing is some good algorithms for finding these clusterings. So the initial paper introduced an algorithm called iterative mistake maximization, nice simple algorithm. And later papers used an even simpler algorithm called random cuts. Okay, and then there are also some heuristics which are designed to work well in practice. Okay, so I'll talk about some of these. And finally, there's this very intriguing data structure that has come out of this work, which is the random cut tree. And it's something that, was ostensibly designed for interpretable clustering, but probably has lots of uses beyond that. So a lot has come out of this work. Okay, so what I'll do then, so I've done a little overview, and now I'll talk about the first algorithm, iterative mistake minimization, then about random cuts, and in each case, I'll also try to give a proof sketch of the price of interpretability. And then I'll talk about experiments, other algorithmic ideas, and finally end up with some open problems. Okay. So iterative mistake minimization. Okay, so here's the idea. So we start with some k-means clustering that's not very interpretable. And now we want to approximate this with a decision tree. So what we do is that we put a box around all the points, and now we search for the first split. We're going to build this tree in a greedy manner, as is standard with decision trees. And so we're going to look for the first split. We're going to try all possible splits. As we know from decision trees, there aren't that many of them. If they're d dimensions, n data points, the number of possible splits is d times n minus 1. Okay, so we're going to try all possible splits. And we're going to pick the one that makes the fewest mistakes. Okay, so we're going to look for a split that that splits off uh, that separates some centers. So initially we have 5 centers. We have one center here, one center here, one center here, one center here, and one center here. K-means gave us those centers, okay? And ultimately, we're going to produce a tree that has one leaf for each of those centers, okay? So in each split, we want to separate some centers, but other than that, we're going to look for the split that makes the fewest mistakes. And this particular split over here makes only one mistake, okay? And here, a mistake means that we have a data point that has got split off from its reference center. This data point should have been with center number 4, and it got separated from it. Okay, so this is a nice split. It makes only one mistake. Now, on this side, we already have just one reference center. On the other side, we have 4 reference centers, so we got to split the other side. And so once more, we search over all possible splits, and this is the next one. Okay, and this one makes a couple of mistakes. These points over here, their closest center is the center for cluster number 3, and they have got separated from their center. And we continue in this way. One more split. And now finally, we have 5 leaves, each leaf containing one of the reference centers. And at the end of the day, we have made not too many mistakes. And the question is, what does that translate to in terms of the price of interpretability? Okay, so this is the algorithm. It's a nice, simple, greedy heuristic. Okay, so here's a quick summary of it. We have a data set. We start with some reference centers. Okay. And we're going to produce a tree which has a leaf containing each of those centers. And so we start with a single cell containing the whole space. And we keep finding the split that separates some centers, but otherwise makes the fewest mistakes. Okay. So what was shown is that if we look at the tree that results, let's say it has a depth of h, then the price of interpretability, the amount, the factor by which the cost of that clustering exceeds that of the original clustering, of the target clustering with the convex regions, is at most 2h plus 1 in the case of k-medians, and at most 8hk plus 2 in the case of k-means. Now, the depth of the tree is ideally going to be something like log k, since there are k leaves, but it could be as bad as k. Okay, and so you can think of this factor as being, at most k, at most O of k, and this factor as being O of k squared, but maybe typically something that's less. Okay. Okay. So just to be a little bit more precise over here, let me just spell out these terms a little bit more. Okay, so let's look at the case of k-medians. Okay, so let's just see exactly what this means. So for each point x, um, it should be allied with its closest reference center. Okay, so let C of x be the index of the closest reference center. Okay. Now, if that's the case, the cost here, what we actually mean is the sum over all the data points of the L1 distance between xi and that particular reference center, the closest reference center of that point. That is the cost of that, that's the cost we're hoping to get. That's the cost of the reference clustering. But in this tree, it might end up with some other center, okay? So maybe it ends up with the center indexed S of x, okay? And so in that case, the cost associated with the tree is the sum over all data points of the distance from the data point to the center that it actually ended up with, okay? And so this is what we want to show. We want to show that this is not too much greater than the target cost, okay? And so, and these are the results that are available. Okay, so let's go ahead and just see how this can be argued, okay? And so basically what I'll be doing is just giving a quick proof overview, and then we'll look at the next algorithm, okay, which is random cuts. So why is it that the tree, the clusters induced by the tree have a cost that's not too much greater than that of the original clustering? Okay. So, how do we build a tree? We've got these cells and then we keep splitting them, okay? So at some stage along the way, let's look at an internal node U of the tree, okay? So we've got this node U. It's got a bunch of data points in it, and it's got a bunch of centers in it, a bunch of reference centers in it. And because it's got 4 centers in it, we're going to have to split this cell, okay? Now, what's going to matter is the bounding box, not of the cell, but of the centers inside it. That's going to be a key quantity, okay? So this is a bounding box just of these red points inside the cell. And another key quantity is going to be the diameter of this bounding box. In other words, the sum of these lengths, the L1 diameter, this length plus this length. Now, the way we're going to split this cell is we're going to look for the cut that separates some of the centers, but other than that, makes the fewest possible mistakes. And we're going to call, so let's say T sub U is this minimum number of mistakes, okay? So one thing that is very easy to show is that the increase in cost, okay, the amount by which the tree increases the cost is at most this quantity. It's the sum over all internal nodes of the tree of the number of mistakes made at that internal node times the diameter of this bounding box of the centers inside that node, okay? And so let me explain why that's the case. So we're doing all these splits, and at the end of the day, if a data point is lucky, it ends up with the correct center. In that case, the cost for that data point is just the original cost. We're not paying anything extra from it. The bad case is when a data point gets separated from its center. It splits off and it ends up with some other center. So the question is, how much extra are we paying for the data point? Well, let's look at the place where it split off from the center. Let's look at where the split occurred, okay? So at some point we had this data point, and this was the correct center, mu sub C of x, and it got split, okay? It happened in some node U. Well, in that case, x is one of the mistakes that occurred at that node. And instead of being with its closest center, it's now with some other center, maybe this guy. But the additional price for X is at most the diameter of the bounding box of the centers. So the additional cost for X is at most this diameter of the bounding box. It's ended up with one of these other centers. And the number of such mistakes that we made in the cell was T sub U. And so the overall increase in cost is just given by this sum over here. Okay. So it's not hard to bound how much the cost goes up. It goes up by at most this quantity, the sum over all internal nodes with the number of mistakes made times the diameter of the bounding box of the centers in that node. So to show that the increase isn't too much, we somehow have to bound this in terms of this cost, okay? And so this is what we have so far, but we have to show that this isn't too large, okay? And the way we can show this is that for any cell, the clustering cost just limited to that cell. If we just look at the points inside the cell, the clustering cost just within that cell is at least this much. Okay, so this quantity, if it's large, if this quantity is large, which seems like the bad case, it must be true that the clustering cost of the points in that cell is actually also very large. Okay, and then that immediately gives us the result. Okay, so this holds for every cell U. And now if we sum up all the cells in a given level, then if we look at all the cells at a given level, the union of those points is the entire data set. Okay, so we on the left-hand side, we get just the L1 clustering cost. And on the right-hand side, we get the sum over cells at that level. And now when we sum over the entire tree, we get this factor of the height of the tree. And so we can finally bound this quantity. So this is the main thing that needs to be shown, that for any given cell of the tree, if it's inevitable that you'll make lots of mistakes on that cell, and the centers within that cell have a high diameter, then the k-median's clustering cost within the cell must actually be pretty high. Okay, and so that's the main lemma, and I can give just a very brief overview of it. Okay, so we have some cell over here, and the thing we want to show is that the cost within the cell, we look at all points within the cell, and we just look at the clustering cost for these points. It's at least the number of mistakes made times the diameter of the bounding box of the centers in that cell times a half. And very roughly, what we're going to do is, okay, so let's just think of a case where these are large, lots of mistakes, large diameter of the bounding box. We then have to show that the clustering cost, okay, the points are actually far from their centers. Okay, so here's a point, and this might be its closest center. So we're going to think of the distance to that center in terms of its components. So there's a component along each coordinate. So this is the component along coordinate number 1. This is the component along coordinate number 2. Okay. And we have to show that this overall distance is actually pretty large. And the way we're going to do that is by showing that it's large along individual coordinates. And let's say we're looking at let's say we're looking at this coordinate, the horizontal coordinate. We'll lower bound it by this segment plus this segment. So what are these segments? Well, if this is coordinate number I, we look at the centers in this. We look at the centers that lie in this cell, okay? And we just look at their ith coordinates. And the first segment is between the first two centers. The next segment is between the next two centers. The third segment is between the third two centers, and so on. Okay, and it turns out that we can bound this distance, we can lower bound this distance, we can lower bound this distance. And so we can lower bound these little segments over here. And by putting together all these little pieces, we get a lower bound on the distance from the total distance from points to their nearest center. Okay, so how do we lower bound these pieces? Well, we look at any two consecutive centers, like let's say we look at this center and this center. And now let's look at this split along, the split right in the middle. We know that any split in this cell makes at least T sub u mistakes because we chose the very best split. So this split makes T sub u mistakes, at least, which means that there are T sub u points that are separated from their centers, okay? So maybe this point, this is an example of a point that's separated from its center. And so for each of these T sub u points, we know that the distance to its center includes at least this segment or this segment. And so for T sub u points, we get a contribution of one of those two segments. Anyway, in this way, we add up these various bits and pieces, and that's how we get this bound. Okay, so it's a little bit hand wavy, but this is roughly how it's done. Okay. And so this gives the result for k-medians. And the result for k-means is really very similar, but k-means is a little harder. Um, so what's the difference? Well, when you have L1 distance, firstly, it satisfies the triangle inequality. L2 squared does not. But L2 squared satisfies a two approximate triangle inequality. So it satisfies the triangle inequality with an extra factor of 2. That's one difference. And the second is with L1 distance. The distance along any coordinate is the sum of these individual segments. Okay, and that's not the case with L2. If you want to do something like that for L2 distance, you have to use the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality, and that just puts in an extra factor of k right there. Okay, so the proof strategy for k-means is really the same, but you have to use an approximate triangle inequality and Cauchy-Schwarz, and that's what you get these extra factors. Okay. So now let me talk about the second scheme. Okay. And a lot of the subsequent work has focused on this method, the random cuts algorithm. So this is a really easy way of producing a tree. Okay. So once again, you have your data set and you have some reference centers, for example, that you got from Lloyd's algorithm or K-means plus plus. And once again, we're going to build the decision tree in a top-down manner. But what we do now is that at the top of the tree, we have a box that has all the data points and centers in it. Let's say this is the box, just for concreteness, minus a to plus a along each of the d dimensions. We are going to pick the splits at random, okay? So at each stage, what we'll do, okay, so we're going to keep splitting until we get down to k leads. And at each stage, what we'll do is that we will pick a random coordinate, okay? So we'll pick a random coordinate r from 1 to d, and we'll pick a random split value along that coordinate. We'll pick a random coordinate and a random split value. And now we look at all the current leaf cells, and we'll say, okay, this random split, does it separate centers within this leaf cell? And if it does, we apply it to the leaf cell, okay? So we will possibly apply the same random split to several leaf cells, okay? And so we keep doing this until we get k leaf cells, each with a reference center. So we're basically picking the cuts entirely at random. So one interesting thing is this does not even look at the data. So this only looks at the reference center. The data does not come into this at all. Okay, so so that's kind of intriguing. And what can be shown is that for k-medians, the tree that you get has got a price of interpretability um, that is log k, and that's the best possible. Okay, it's there's a lower bound which says that you can't do better than that. Now for k-means, the again, you use a random cuts procedure, but the sampling distribution is a little bit more intricate. Okay, and frankly, it probably hasn't been it probably there's probably room for improvement to make it a little simpler and more elegant. And so that's why I'm just going to talk about the k-means case over here. Okay, sorry, the k-medians case over here. Okay, so okay, so this is the random cut method, and how do you analyze this? So so here's what you can actually show, which is something that's even stronger than what's needed. Okay, pick any data point. And this doesn't have to be a data point in your data set because the method doesn't even look at the data set. Okay, so pick any data point you like. Okay, let's say this is its closest reference center. You do all these random cuts. It ends up with some other center, and the center it ends up with is a random variable because you did random cuts. What you can show is the expected cost of that point, the expected distance to the center it ends up with, is at most log k times the distance to the nearest center. Okay? And because this holds for each point individually, it also holds for the overall cost in expectation. Okay? And so the argument goes just by proving it for an individual data point. And it doesn't matter what that point is. Okay, it could be anything. Okay. So what are the kind of calculations that go into this? And I'll just give a very rough sketch over here. Um, um, so in the case of iterative mistake minimization, the thing I sketched was actually the essentially the entire proof. Over here, I'll just give a rough sketch of some of the ideas, okay? So the first thing is that let's say we pick one of these cuts. What's the chance that it separates a data point from some center? Okay, maybe it's closest center, maybe some other center. What's the chance that it separates a point from some center? Okay, well, um, so you start by picking a random feature. So the feature you pick R could be anything from 1 to D, each with probability 1 over D. And if you pick feature number R, then the chance that you split X from the center is simply the chance that the split value you pick. Okay, so this is the feature 1 to D. And this is the split value, which is between the upper and lower bounds for the data. So let's just say from minus A to plus A. So you pick a feature, and the probability that you split those two is simply that your split value lies between the rth coordinate of the data point and the rth coordinate of that center. And the chance of that is simply the entire range from which the split value is chosen. That's the denominator, and the numerator is the actual distance between the rth feature of X and the rth feature of mu sub J. And so when you do this summation, it turns out that there's this nice simple formula. There's a really nice, very simple formula for the probability that you split a point from a particular center. Okay, so that's the first kind of observation, that this random cut method gives us a nice formula for when a point gets split from a center. Okay, so now let's look at a particular point X. And let's just say without loss of generality that the centers are such that its nearest center is mu sub 1, and then mu sub 2 is a little further, and mu sub 3 is a little further, and so on. What is the chance that at the end of the day, X ends up with some really far away center mu sub s instead of with its closest center mu sub 1? What's the chance of that happening? Now, that would happen if we get a bad cut, something like this. So this cut over here separates, it has X and this far away center on one side, and the good center, mu sub 1, is separated, okay? Whereas a good cut is something like this, which keeps X sub X and its reference center together and separates off the bad guy, okay? So we have to look at the relative probabilities of these two cuts. And again, this is very simple to characterize. So let's look at this. So what is the probability of a good cut? Okay, so this first one is a good cut. What's the probability of something like this? Okay, so it's the probability that we split the bad center, okay, the one that's far away, but we do not split the one that's close by. And for each of these, we just apply our simple formula. So it's the distance from X to mu sub S minus the distance from X to mu sub 1. So a nice simple formula for it. And what's the probability of a bad cut? What's the chance that we split X from mu sub 1, but we retain mu sub S? Well, we don't even need to think about mu sub S. It's at most the probability that we split X from mu 1. And again, we apply our formula. It's just the distance from X to mu 1. Okay. And then basically sort of a back of the envelope calculation shows that if you look at the centers that are significantly further away, okay, if you look at the centers that are more than log k times the distance from X to its closest center, if you look at all of them together, the chance that on one of them you would get a bad cut before a good cut is actually very small. And that's the overall strategy. Okay, so this whole randomness, the randomness in the procedure enables a very clean analysis. And several of the papers use this random cut method. And over time, the methods of analyzing the process have been getting more and more refined, getting cleaner and cleaner. And I think there's still a ways to go. So, okay. So now let me talk about some experiments. And these are going to be entirely with k-means because that's what actually matters in practice. It's just a cost function. I mean, there's nothing inherently, I think, better about it than k-medians. It's just the one that people are familiar with and that's, that's very widely used. So, one greedy heuristic is the one that I mentioned, iterative mistake minimization. Another greedy heuristic, which was introduced by Labère and Moutinho, is to, again, start with the data and a reference clustering, and then greedily pick the best split, okay? But now to pick the split that minimizes the k-means cost of the left-hand side of the split, okay, plus the k-means cost of the right-hand side of the split. Okay, so you have a cell U, you split it into the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And now the cost on the left-hand side is the sum over all data points on the left of the distance of that point to its nearest center amongst the reference centers that are also in there. And then the same thing for the right-hand side. So another very natural cost function, okay? And they call this the explainable greedy cost. And so these are experiments from their paper, from Labère and Moutinho, where they just chose a bunch of random data sets of varying sizes, dimensions, different values of k. And they looked at the results of these two greedy heuristics. Okay, so this is iterative mistake minimization. This is explainable greedy. And you can see, I mean, to me, the most striking thing is not whether one is better than the other, but that the factors are actually quite small. Okay, this is k-means. The factors are not k. Okay, the bounds say k, but here the factors all look fairly close to one. And so, in practice, maybe the price of interpretability is actually not that high at all. Okay, and so this is kind of reassuring. So second thing I'll talk about is a really cool idea, which is to grow the tree further. Okay, so you start with this reference clustering that you're trying to simulate, they're trying to approximate using something that's interpretable. But instead of stopping at a tree with k leaves, why not go further? Okay, so maybe go to 2k. And so we'll end up with more clusters at the end. The clusters will still be these hyperrectangles, will still be interpretable, and we'll continue to associate each cluster with one of the original reference centers. Okay, so it turns out that if you do this experimentally, the results are good. If you go to, say, 2k leaves, you get much closer to the k-means cost of the reference clustering. Okay, so this is giving you just a little bit more leeway. At the end, the clusters associated with each reference center are now not just a single hyperrectangle, but maybe a union of 2 or 3 hyperrectangles. And that gives you a little bit more modeling power. Um, okay. And then there is this really remarkable theoretical result, um, which shows what happens when you do this with random cut trees. It shows that, let's say we use this random cuts method, and instead of stopping at k clusters, we go to 1 plus delta times k clusters. Okay, so maybe 3 hats k or 2k. Then the expected cost for k-means is this. And the main thing to point out over here is that this factor, remember that the factor was k, okay, um, for a tree with k leaves. So for k-means, the price of interpretability was a factor of k. Okay, so if you stop the tree at k leaves, that's the best it's going to be. But by growing it just a little bit more, 1.5k, 2k, the factor drops from k to log squared k, okay, which is quite remarkable. And again, this is shown by a method that does not look at the data points. And therefore, this particular relation holds an expectation for any individual data point, okay, just like we saw before. So this is a really cool result. And to me, it seems like it would have many other applications in things like nearest neighbor search, for example. Um, okay. So let me just end with a couple of open problems. And I mean, to me, the obvious open problems are these two things, which is that good, we actually have really good results for k-means. It's a very compelling way of generating interpretable k-means clusterings. So let's just move on to the two, next most popular clustering methods, which are Gaussian mixture models and hierarchical clustering. So I think perhaps the most, like this might be the most immediate to move to a Gaussian mixture model. The problem with k-means is that if you're looking at, if you're using clustering for an exploratory analysis of a data set, k-means is a little bit problematic because it likes clusters that are roughly the same size and are spherical. So for example, in k-means is not happy when the clusters look like this. K-means does not allow that, okay? Because if you have one cluster center here and one cluster center here, the Voronoi partition is going to be this. So K-means simply does not allow clusters that look like this. Whereas in exploratory data analysis, it's inevitable that you would get, clusters of different shapes and sizes. Gaussian mixture models would permit that. And so it'd be really nice to have some interpretable method for that. And when it comes to hierarchical clusterings, then interpretability often just goes out of the window because in hierarchical clustering, typically the clusters are not even convex regions. They're literally arbitrary subsets of the points. And so it would be very nice if they were constrained in some way. Okay, so to me, these two seem like the two fairly big general open problems. And then I think another very interesting open problem is to look at the random cuts algorithm and to understand it better and to see what else it might be used for. Okay, so let me end there, and I just want to thank my three collaborators, Nave, Michal, and Cyrus.
Right, thanks a lot, Sanjoy. I think I'm messing with Zoom. Yeah, we can take questions in the audience. Oh, yeah, and everyone's clapping.
Thank you.
If anyone wants to ask a question, just feel free to unmute and ask it.
Oh, I have one. Thank you very much for the talk. This was very interesting. I agree. Clustering or unsupervised learning in general is certainly an interesting topic for interpretability. So I was wondering, it seems that everybody just works on approximating clusterings with decision trees. Couldn't you also think about directly computing a decision tree that represents the clustering? So you would basically reformulate the k-means clustering problem instead of saying you want to determine the clusters, you want to determine. Okay, maybe that's difficult. But the question is basically why not directly consider a clustering problem for decision trees?
Right. So great. Yeah. So the question is that if at the end of the day we want our clustering to be a decision tree, why are we going about it in this roundabout way where we start with a k-means clustering and then we try to approximate that with a decision tree? Why not just go directly to a decision tree clustering? And I think that makes a lot of sense. So a couple of things about that. So one of the reasons for doing it this way was, at least initially, was to understand the price of interpretability. Okay, but now that we essentially understand what it is, that it's log k in the case of k medians and k in the case of k means, now the next thing is to just go directly to a decision tree clustering. And so it's an interesting optimization problem. Okay. It's one that is NP hard, but it's also one that can be solved exactly in time, something like n to the 2d. So in low dimensions, it can be solved exactly. And the reason for that is that there just aren't that many hyperrectangles. The space of hyperrectangles has VC dimension 2d. Okay. So if you have n data points, there aren't that many distinct hyperrectangles to consider. And so you can write a dynamic programming algorithm where what you want to do is to find the best k prime mean solution for each hyperrectangle, where k prime goes from 1 to k. And so your original problem is just the big hyperrectangle containing all the data with the original value of k. But now you look at smaller hyperrectangles and different values, smaller values of k, and you can put it all together using dynamic programming pretty easily and get a solution of that form. So that's something that's known, that it can be solved exactly in time, something like n to the 2d. But beyond that, I mean, that algorithm is is, technically polynomial in low dimension, but you probably wouldn't even want to implement that in 2 or 3 dimensions because it's a bit of a messy algorithm. So in terms of better algorithms, it seems like there's a lot of, a lot of scope for improvement.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Otherwise, I have a kind of a technical question. I was wondering, so you have these bounds in expectation, but the cost is non-negative. So is it correct to guess that if you try a couple of times and then check if you are within this cost factor, then you could also get something with high probability from these in expectation bounds?
Right. So actually I don't know. I don't know what the tails look like here. And so that's and when I was showing some experiments, they were just for the greedy methods. It could be quite a bit worse for the random cut method. Yeah. So the issue of getting in probability bounds is I think open.
Okay, thanks. Maybe one more quick question if there's time.
Sure.
So I was wondering, this idea with decision trees makes a lot of sense, but did people consider other explanation methods for cluster?
Well, decision trees just seems like a fairly uncontroversial or, not as controversial as other things. One thing that really would be great is to have, because so much of the work in clustering has focused on clustering in metric spaces, for example. And over there, what do you do for interpretability? There are all sorts of simple and beautiful algorithms, and then, what would be an interpretable clustering in a general metric space? I don't know. So yeah, it would be nice if if there were other models.
Okay, I think in view of the time, we have to wrap up. So let's thank Sanjoy again. Sanjoy, many thanks for this great talk. Yeah, so we're going to, I think we have your permission to put the video online, right?
Sure, yeah.
So we're going to put the recording on YouTube in the Theory of Interpretable AI seminar channel, and you can find it back there.